In this video, I'm going to take you through a character analysis of Abigail Williams from Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, and of course some of the key quotes you might want to use in your exams. The play is set in 1692 and covers the mass hysteria that gripped the town of Salem as accusations of witchcraft began, ultimately leading to the deaths of many innocent people. Abigail Williams is 17 years old and is the main antagonist of the play, meaning she is essentially one of the villains. However, she is quite a complex character in this sense, as she may also be seen as an anti-hero rather than a full-on villain. Abigail is an orphan who was taken in by her uncle, the Reverend of Salem, Reverend Samuel Parris. She now lives in his house along with his young daughter Betty Parris and his slave Tituba. As Abigail is unmarried and relies on her uncle to keep a roof over her head, she has a very low social status and virtually no power in the village as the play starts. Although Abigail is young, she has previously had an affair with John Proctor, an older farmer married to Elizabeth Proctor. Abigail used to work in the Proctor household, but when Elizabeth discovered the affair between the two, she promptly dismissed Abigail from her work. This led to rumours in Salem about the cause of Abigail's dismissal, although the affair remains unknown by the townspeople at the start of the play. Prior to the opening events of Act 1, Abigail and several of the other young girls from Salem, including Betty Parris, were out in the woods late at night. They were dancing round a fire, singing songs, and running naked in the woods. Reverend Parris mentions that Tituba, who was also there, was speaking in a language he did not recognise and waving her arms over a fire. He also saw a kettle with a frog in it, leading him to believe the girls were involved in witchcraft. Abigail denies that she and the girls engaged in witchcraft. She states that Betty merely fainted from shock when her father caught them dancing. Parris fears that his enemies will use the scandal to drive him out of his office. In Act 1, Abigail's uncle, Reverend Parris, is asking her why Elizabeth Proctor dismissed her from working in her house, and why Elizabeth refuses to sit near Abigail in church. Abigail tells her uncle, "She hates me, uncle, she must, for I would not be her slave. It's a bitter woman, a lying, cold, snivelling woman, and I will not work for such a woman." Firstly, this quote is the first introduction to Elizabeth Proctor's character that the audience gets. This is quite a manipulative introduction, as we take Abigail's word that Elizabeth does display all of these negative qualities. It's only later, when we actually meet Elizabeth Proctor in Act 2, that we see that Abigail has manipulated her uncle by describing Elizabeth in this way. It becomes clear that Abigail has a deep hatred for Elizabeth Proctor, since Elizabeth dismissed her from her work, after suspecting there was something going on between Abigail and her husband John. This manipulation foreshadows or echoes the manipulation that Abigail will carry out throughout the rest of the play. Secondly, this quote indicates to the audience that Abigail is willing to risk her own reputation to speak so poorly about a woman of higher status in the village. Abigail is an unmarried orphan girl. Therefore, she is quite low down in the pecking order of the Puritan Salem society that she lives in. Speaking in this negative manner is not only socially unacceptable for a young Christian girl in Salem, but it would also be unusual for her to speak in this way towards her uncle, who's a reverend. The fact that she does shows that she wants to convince her uncle that her reputation in the village is immaculate, and it is in fact Elizabeth Proctor who is the problem. The final point for this quote is that it links in strongly with the theme of lies. Abigail does not want to admit her affair with John Proctor to her uncle, as she relies on him to take care of her since she is an orphan. Committing adultery is a sin, and if this was found out, both Abigail and John would be severely punished or put to death for their actions. Abigail uses the excuse that Elizabeth Proctor was treating her as a slave, rather than a housekeeper, as to the reason why she was dismissed, so that her uncle does not become suspicious of her. We start to see how easy it is for Abigail to lie to those around her. Again in Act 1, Abigail is left alone in the attic of her uncle's house with her young cousin Betty and two other teenage girls from the village, Mary and Mercy. Betty is threatening to tell her father about the night the girls danced in the woods, and that Abigail drank a blood charm to kill Goody Proctor. Mary Warden is also trying to get Abigail to tell the truth. Abigail then says, "And mark this, let either of you breathe a word, or the edge of a word, about the other things, and I will come to you in the black of some terrible night, and I will bring a pointy reckoning that will shudder you." This quote shows that Abigail is not afraid to threaten violence on her friends if they reveal what they were doing in the woods together. Abigail knows that if this information was to come out, she would be punished and possibly put out of her house for disgracing her uncle. She could also face the accusation of witchcraft and be hung for it. Abigail decides, rather than persuade her friends to stick by her, she would much rather control them with fear and with threats. As with the previous quote we looked at, this way of speaking and her actions towards the girls would be socially unacceptable for a good Christian girl of the time. She creates an atmosphere of fear that surrounds her throughout the rest of the play and only heightens as she gains power for the duration of the witch trials. This quote also shows that although Abigail has a low status in society, she does in fact have power and a high status amongst the young girls of Salem. She is able to manipulate and threaten the girls to do her bidding and to stick to her version of the events in the woods. This highlights that Abigail is a bully, and she will only do something for her own gain, a theme that carries on in her character as the story progresses. This threat foreshadows the events that are to come. Just as she threatens to hurt her friends if they don't do as she says, she then later throws accusations of witchcraft onto anyone she perceives to be standing in the way of her getting what she wants, which is to be with John Proctor. In Act 1, Abigail is then left alone with John Proctor in the attic of her uncle's house. Proctor denies coming to the house just to see Abigail, and she reveals to the audience that the two had an affair, and this is indeed the reason she was dismissed from the Proctor house. Abigail is convinced that John is still in love with her, and says, "I have a sense for heat, John, and yours has me drawn to my window, and I've seen you looking up, burning in your loneliness. You are no wintry man, John. I know you, John. I know you." This quote demonstrates a difference between Abigail and the rest of the women in Salem. The language and sensual imagery used shows her to be much more sophisticated and experienced than her uncle Paris or the community would believe of a young girl of the time. The part of the quote where she is saying that she knows John has a double meaning. Firstly, she is implying that she understands John on a greater level than anyone else, including his wife Elizabeth. She is trying to prove that she is a better choice for him compared to her. Secondly, she is making a suggestive comment that is reminding John that she has had a sexual relationship with him. In certain translations of the Bible, to have known someone is another way of saying that they had slept together. This description of John from Abigail's perspective suggests that everyone else in the village, including his wife, views him as cold or wintry, as she puts it, yet she claims to know a different side to him. The connotations of heat between them, and coming from John in particular, suggest that he is lusting after her. This exchange is flirty and explicit for the times, which shows us Abigail's forward and confident personality. This quote also highlights that although John Proctor is insisting he has no longer got feelings for Abigail, she will not accept this as the truth. The fact she has caught John staring up at her window is giving her hope that he still desires her. Abigail also uses this to make another jab at Elizabeth, by suggesting that John is lonely, even in the company of her and their children. Proctor's determination to remain faithful to Elizabeth after his prior lapse in judgment only motivates Abigail further in her desires to take Elizabeth's place by any means possible, as she clearly thinks that she is the better choice and won't be outdone. At the end of Act 1, Abigail witnesses Reverend Hail encouraging and praising Tituba for confessing to witchcraft and naming others that she knows were involved. He tells her that God will bless her for her help, and implies that she will be protected if she reveals more witches. Abigail then suddenly says, "I want to open myself. I want the light of God. I want the sweet love of Jesus. I danced for the devil. I saw him. I wrote in his book. I go back to Jesus. I kiss his hand. I saw Sarah Good with the devil. I saw Goody Osborne with the devil. I saw Bridget Bishop with the devil." This quote highlights that Abigail is a quick thinker and realises that if she reveals that she did indeed partake in the witchcraft in the woods, but now wishes to redeem herself, she will be admired for her bravery. Abigail understands that by doing this, she can put herself in a position of power. If she was to stay silent, then one of the other girls could accuse her of witchcraft, but by confessing and saying that she is returned to God, she has made sure that she is the one in control of the situation. This quote once again shows that Abigail puts herself first in every situation. By naming other women in the village, she has turned suspicion from herself and onto them, with little thought or care to what might become of these women now they've been accused by both her and Tituba. Abigail's repeated use of religious language increases the intensity of her speech, and she is doing this to persuade Hail and Paris that she is sincere, as religion is held on the highest pillar in her community, and to use this language in vain would be unheard of. Using language that refers to God and his love in a Puritan society would be taken very seriously and not questioned. Abigail is abusing that knowledge to get herself out of her predicament. The fact that Reverend Hail, a respected outsider who has a reputation for ridding towns of witches, believes her, puts Abigail on a pedestal compared to others in the village. Even though this is a quick exchange, this quote is the catalyst for the events of the play going forward. Abigail is now in a position of power and is able to accuse Elizabeth Proctor of witchcraft in the hopes to take her place as John's wife. In Act 3, Abigail has been brought into the Salem courtroom to face Mary Warren, who's accused Abigail and the rest of the girls of lying about witchcraft and faking having spells and curses put upon them by the accused. Abigail is questioned by Judge Danforth and loses her cool when John Proctor announces their affair to the court. However, Abigail claims to see a yellow bird on the rafters of the courtroom and begins speaking to it. She says, "But God made my face. You cannot want to tear my face. Envy is a deadly sin, Mary. Oh, Mary, this is a black art to change your shape. No, I cannot stop my mouth. It is God's work that I do." In this moment, Abigail recognises that she runs the risk of losing the trust of the court officials, the people who currently give her power. She once again uses manipulation and control to her own advantage. She knows that the rest of the girls in the courtroom will side with her, meaning Mary Warren, who is already weak, will be outnumbered by her peers. She begins repeating Mary's words, then the rest of the girls quickly join in, causing Mary to become distressed and panic. The quote has connotations that the yellow bird that Abigail sees is communicating with her, and that she thinks it wants to hurt her and scratch her face. This reference is particularly telling about Abigail's character, as she states that Mary is clearly jealous of her beauty and is sending her spirit out to take that away from her. Abigail could not resist highlighting, once again to the courtroom and everyone in it, that she thinks very highly of herself and of her appearance compared to her friends. She also reinforces her position of power within the group of girls by implying that she is often envied by others. This quote also shows the themes of hysteria and witchcraft. Abigail claims that Mary has changed her shape and is in fact the yellow bird. By stating this is a black art, she is plainly telling the court that Mary Warren is performing witchcraft in front of their eyes, and due to the collective reaction of the group of girls around her, they have no choice but to believe her. Once again, Abigail reminds the court that she is doing God's work, implying that she is somehow special and she is an instrument for God himself. She implies that Mary wants to silence her due to the fact that she has been, up until this point, accusing the correct people as guided by God. This situation makes it very difficult for Mary Warren to continue to stand up to Abigail, as not only would she be standing up against her peers and her bully, she would be standing up against the religious aspects of Abigail's accusations. Mary ultimately realises that she cannot win, and runs once again into Abigail's arms, who, in an ironic act of charity put on for the courtroom, embraces and accepts her back into the fold. The irony of the Salem court is not lost on the audience. A courtroom should be a place where truth prevails, but here the audience understand that only the liars are to be believed in this situation. I hope you find this video useful. Don't forget to check out my other videos on the Crucible that I have on my channel.